Good evening, and congratulations, you've chosen boredom on purpose. Tonight we're diving into one of history's most literally crappy professions, and I mean that in the most technical sense possible. Picture this: you're standing in a medieval town square, your stomach gnawing at your ribs, like an angry rodent watching merchants hawk their wares while you clutch your last copper coin. The smell of fresh bread wafts past your nose, but you can't afford even the stale crusts. Your calloused hands tell the story of every odd job you've scraped together, hauling stones, mucking stables, patching roofs, but work has dried up faster than a puddle in August. You're about to discover that when desperation meets opportunity, sometimes that opportunity comes with a shovel and a lifetime supply of regret. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I always love seeing our global community of insomniacs and history nerds. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing outside the town's hiring hall, if you can call a wooden board nailed to a post, a hall scanning the notices for any work that might keep you fed another day. Most postings require skills you don't possess or tools you can't afford, but one catches your eye not because it's appealing, but because it's still there after weeks of being ignored. The parchment is stained and weathered, the ink slightly smeared advertising for experienced waste removal specialists. The pay listed makes your eyes widen. It's more than you've seen offered for manual labor in months. There's got to be a catch, you think, and you're absolutely right. The catch becomes clear when you ask around. Gong farming. They call it, though it has nothing to do with actual farming and everything to do with the most fundamental human need that polite society pretends doesn't exist. Medieval towns, you see, had a waste management problem that would make modern sanitation workers weep. Without proper sewage systems, human waste accumulated in private latrines, public cesspits, and trenches throughout the community. Someone had to clean these out periodically, or disease would spread faster than gossip at a church social. That someone, it turns out, could be you. The job posting might as well have been written in blood with the subtitle, "Abandon hope, all ye who enter here," because once you become a gong farmer, you're not just taking a job, you're accepting a social death sentence that comes with a steady paycheck. Historians still argue whether the term gong comes from the Old English word for privy or from the sound workers made while gagging, but either etymology feels grimly appropriate. Standing there in the fading afternoon light, you weigh your options with the mathematical precision of someone who has exactly zero alternatives. Starvation is guaranteed if you don't work. Social ostracism is guaranteed if you do. But social ostracism while fed beats social ostracism while dead, and the medieval world isn't particularly known for its robust social safety nets. You probably won't survive this career choice with your dignity intact, but dignity doesn't buy bread, and bread is currently winning the philosophical debate happening in your empty stomach. The decision crystallizes with the rumbling of your gut and the cold realization that pride is a luxury you literally cannot afford. You approach the contact listed on the posting, usually a town official or established gong farmer looking for fresh recruits, and discover that the interview process is refreshingly straightforward. Can you lift heavy things? Can you work nights? Do you have a functioning sense of smell that you're willing to sacrifice to the gods of necessity? Congratulations, you're hired. What you don't realize yet is that you're about to join one of medieval society's most essential yet reviled professions, a job so necessary that communities would collapse without it, yet so stigmatized that practitioners lived as walking reminders of everything civilized people preferred to ignore. You're trading your social standing for survival, your health for wages, and your future for the immediate promise of not starving today. The medieval world ran on a complex ecosystem of interdependence where every profession served a vital function, but some functions were more vital and less celebrated than others. Gong farming sat at the absolute bottom of this hierarchy, not because it was unimportant, but because it was so important that society needed someone to do it while allowing everyone else to pretend it didn't exist. The sun sets like a curtain falling on your former life, and you realize why your new profession operates exclusively under cover of darkness. Medieval society had mastered the art of willful ignorance when it came to waste management. They desperately needed the service, but absolutely refused to acknowledge it during daylight hours. It's like having a vampire cleaning service, except instead of avoiding sunlight to prevent combustion, you're avoiding it to prevent riots, public shaming, and the occasional thrown vegetables from disgusted townspeople. Your first evening as a Gong farmer begins with meeting your supervisor, a weathered man whose face tells the story of 2 decades spent breathing things that shouldn't be breathed. He introduces himself with the kind of gallows humor that only develops after years of literal gallows-adjacent work, explaining that Gong farmers earned the nickname Nightmen, not for any mysterious or romantic reasons, but because civilized society simply couldn't handle the reality of their existence during business hours. The irony isn't lost on you that the people who keep the town from drowning in its own waste are treated like they're the actual waste. The timing isn't arbitrary. There's a practical psychology to working after sunset that goes beyond mere social convenience. During the day, people are trying to live their lives, conduct business, and maintain the comfortable fiction that human waste simply vanishes into the ether through some medieval magic. Your presence would shatter that illusion like a hammer through stained glass, forcing confrontation with biological realities that everyone prefers to ignore. Night work allows the community to benefit from your services while maintaining plausible deniability about the whole arrangement. As darkness settles over the town like a merciful blanket, you begin to understand the bizarre social contract you've entered. The same people who cross the street to avoid you during your off hours are the very ones whose waste you'll be handling tonight. There's something almost philosophical about it. You're literally cleaning up after people who consider you untouchable, performing intimate services for a community that treats you as invisible. Historians still argue whether this paradox was intentionally designed to maintain social order or simply evolved naturally from collective squeamishness, but the result is the same. You exist in a professional limbo where you're simultaneously essential and erased. Your supervisor explains the night schedule with the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing crop rotation rather than the logistics of human waste removal. Most Gong farmers work from sunset to sunrise, though the exact hours depend on the size of the job and the cooperation of the weather. Rain makes everything worse, not just because it's miserable to work in, but because wet waste is heavier waste, and heavier waste means more backbreaking labor for the same miserable pay. You're already learning that this profession comes with weather-related occupational hazards that farmers and sailors never have to consider. The darkness that shields you from social judgment also creates practical challenges that daylight workers never face. Medieval towns weren't exactly blazing with street lamps, so you'll be navigating narrow alleys, uneven cobblestones, and the occasional aggressive drunk while carrying buckets of things that really shouldn't be spilled on public thoroughfares. Your supervisor hands you a small oil lamp with the warning that you'll need to be careful not to create any sparks near the methane-rich environments you'll be working in. Apparently exploding while removing excrement is a workplace hazard that really puts other job complaints into perspective. The psychological adjustment to night work proves almost as challenging as the physical demands. While the rest of the town sleeps peacefully in their beds, you're wide awake shoveling your way through humanity's most private contributions to municipal infrastructure. There's an eerie quality to working while everyone else dreams, like being the only person awake in a world of sleepwalkers. You become intimately familiar with the sounds of night, not just the owls and crickets, but the creaking of settling buildings, the distant barking of dogs, and the occasional drunk stumbling home with no idea that their morning bathroom visit is being pre-arranged by someone they'd rather never meet. The nightmen designation becomes a badge of identity that separates you from the daytime world as effectively as a physical barrier. You're shifting into a different temporal universe, one where the normal rules of social interaction are suspended in favor of pure functionality. During these dark hours, you're not a person with feelings, aspirations, or dignity. You're a waste removal specialist, a human tool designed for a specific purpose that polite society requires but refuses to acknowledge. Your first night reveals the strange camaraderie that develops among people who work in society's shadow. The few souls you encounter during your shift night, watchmen bakers starting their pre-dawn prep, the occasional emergency physician, nod with understanding rather than disgust. There's a mutual recognition among night workers that you're all operating outside normal social conventions, each serving essential functions that the daylight world depends on but prefers not to examine too closely. By dawn, you understand why this profession exists in temporal exile. As the sun rises and respectable people begin their daily routines, you're heading home to sleep, carrying with you the smell and knowledge of services rendered while the town was unconscious. You've become part of the invisible infrastructure that keeps civilization running a night shift worker in humanity's most fundamental industry. Your supervisor produces a collection of tools that look deceptively simple until you realize they're specifically designed for humanity's most challenging waste management scenarios. The medieval Gong farmer's toolkit represents centuries of trial, error, and grim innovation, each implement crafted through the hard-won experience of people who discovered what works when you're literally up to your neck in human waste. It's like inheriting a family heirloom collection, except instead of fine china or jewelry, you're receiving shovels that have seen things no respectable shovel should ever witness. The primary weapon in your arsenal is the long-handled shovel designed with a reach that keeps you as far as possible from your work while still maintaining functional leverage. Medieval metalworkers understood that gong farming required specialized equipment. The handle extends nearly 6 feet, allowing you to work from the edge of a cesspit rather than climbing directly into the center. The blade is broader and deeper than a standard digging shovel, engineered to move maximum volume with minimum scoops. Your supervisor demonstrates the proper grip with the reverence of a master craftsman, explaining that this tool will either be your best friend or your mortal enemy, depending on how well you learn to use it. The bucket system reveals medieval engineering at its most pragmatic. These aren't delicate vessels, they're robust containers designed to withstand the weight and corrosive nature of human waste, while maintaining structural integrity during transport. Made from thick wood bound with iron hoops, each bucket can hold approximately 2 gallons of material that weighs considerably more than water. The handles are reinforced because the last thing you want is a catastrophic bucket failure while navigating narrow stairs or uneven terrain. Historians still argue whether the standard bucket size was determined by optimal carrying capacity or simply what a desperate person could lift without permanent spinal damage. But the practical result is the same. Your cart represents the pinnacle of medieval waste transportation technology, and that's a sentence you never imagined would be relevant to your life. Built low to the ground for stability and equipped with wide wheels to navigate cobblestone streets, it's designed to carry multiple full buckets without tipping over or creating the kind of spillage that would turn public relations disasters into actual disasters. The cart bed is lined with additional waterproofing because medieval communities learned the hard way that waste-related leaks during transport could contaminate water supplies and spread disease faster than rumors about the baker's wife. The specialized clothing becomes apparent as essential protective equipment rather than fashion choices. Your supervisor provides you with a heavy leather apron that extends from chest to knees, explaining that this barrier serves multiple functions: protection from splashing chemical resistance against the acidic nature of waste, and an additional layer between you and the various parasites that consider human excrement prime real estate. The leather has been treated with oils and waxes that make it somewhat waterproof, though waterproof in medieval terms means resistant to immediate penetration rather than completely impervious. Gloves prove surprisingly sophisticated for the era, crafted from thick leather that extends well up the forearms. These aren't the delicate hand coverings worn by nobles for falconry. They're industrial strength protection designed to prevent direct skin contact with materials that could cause chemical burns, infections, or worse. The leather has been specially treated to resist degradation from the acidic and bacterial environment you'll be working in. Your supervisor warns that even with gloves, you should never touch your face during work because medieval medicine's understanding of disease transmission was limited, but their understanding of don't put waste-covered hands near your mouth was remarkably advanced. The rope and pulley system represents medieval mechanical engineering applied to waste management challenges. Many cesspits and latrines are built deeper than a person can safely climb out of, especially when exhausted from heavy labor and breathing toxic fumes. The pulley allows you to haul buckets up from depths that would otherwise require dangerous climbing, while the rope serves as both a safety line and a means of maintaining contact with your partners working above ground. It's a simple system that could mean the difference between completing a job and becoming a permanent part of it. Your lamp receives special attention during the equipment briefing because working in darkness around methane rich environments creates fire hazards that didn't exist in other medieval professions. The oil lamp is designed with protective shields to prevent accidental ignition of gases that accumulate in enclosed waste areas. Your supervisor explains the warning signs of dangerous gas buildup, flickering flames, difficulty breathing, and the sensation of lightheadedness that might not be entirely from the smell. This occupational safety knowledge represents hard-won experience from Gong farmers who learned these lessons the explosive way. The final tool in your arsenal is perhaps the most important, a long wooden pole used for testing the depth and consistency of waste before committing to full excavation. This seemingly simple implement prevents you from stepping into cesspit areas that might be deeper than expected or discovering structural problems with the pit walls after you're already committed to the descent. It's like a medieval depth sounder, except instead of measuring water, you're measuring substances that water wouldn't associate with if it had a choice in the matter. Standing there in the lamplight, surrounded by tools designed specifically for civilization's most fundamental challenge, you realize you're being inducted into a profession that represents the intersection of necessity, innovation, and social rejection. These implements aren't just tools, they're the accumulated wisdom of countless people who discovered what works when society needs essential services performed by people it prefers to pretend don't exist. Your first ascent into a cesspit feels like voluntarily entering the mouth of hell if hell specialized in human waste management and had significantly worse ventilation. The wooden ladder creaks ominously under your weight as you climb down into what can only be described as humanity's most concentrated failure of urban planning. The walls close in around you, rough stone and mortar that has absorbed decades of moisture and biological matter, creating a surface that seems to pulse with its own malevolent life. This is the moment when the theoretical becomes viscerally, inescapably real. You're about to become intimately acquainted with the collective digestive output of an entire neighborhood. The first thing that hits you isn't the smell, surprisingly, it's the temperature. The cesspit maintains a warm, almost tropical climate created by the active decomposition of organic matter. It's like stepping into a greenhouse, except instead of nurturing beautiful flowers, this environment is cultivating bacteria, parasites, and gases that make your eyes water instantly. Medieval builders constructed these pits deeper than they were wide, typically 6 to 8 feet down, creating a confined space that concentrates everything you're about to spend the next several hours moving bucket by bucket. The waste itself defies your expectations of what you thought you were prepared for. It's not the simple uniform substance you might have imagined, but a complex ecosystem of decomposing matter at various stages of breakdown. The surface layer is relatively fresh, still recognizable as recent human contributions, but as you probe deeper with your testing pole, you discover archaeological layers of waste that tell the story of months or years of accumulation. The consistency varies from liquid at the bottom to semi-solid in the middle layers, creating a work environment that shifts and changes with every shovelful you remove. Your boots sink into the muck with a sound that will haunt your dreams for years to come, a wet, sucking noise that seems to echo with the weight of poor life choices. The waist is ankle deep initially, but you quickly realize that the pit's contents have settled into a deceptive topography. What looks like solid footing can suddenly give way to deeper pockets of liquid waste that threaten to fill your boots with substances that no footwear was designed to contain. You learn to test each step carefully, using your shovel as a walking stick to avoid sudden depth changes that could turn an already terrible job into a catastrophic personal disaster. The physical act of shoveling human waste proves more challenging than any agricultural work you've ever done. The material is dense heavy and has a tendency to stick to your shovel in ways that defy the normal laws of physics. Each scoop requires not just lifting, but scraping as the waste clings to your tools with what seems like deliberate malice. Your supervisor watches from above, occasionally shouting advice about technique that you're pretty sure isn't covered in any standard manual of medieval labor practices. The rhythm you develop is awkward and exhausting. Scoop scrape, lift dump into bucket repeat until your back screams for mercy or the pit is empty, whichever comes first. The bucket filling process becomes an exercise in precision engineering under the worst possible conditions. You need to pack each bucket efficiently to minimize the number of trips required, but overfilling leads to spillage during the climb out of the pit. The waste has its own physics. It doesn't pour like water or pile like dirt, but behaves more like a malevolent pudding that seems to actively resist your efforts at organized removal. You develop a technique for layering different consistencies within each bucket, creating a stable load that won't shift during transport while maximizing capacity. Breathing becomes a conscious act rather than an automatic function. The air in the cesspit is thick with methane hydrogen sulfide and other gases produced by decomposing organic matter. Your supervisor warned you about the signs of dangerous gas concentration, but experiencing it firsthand feels like trying to breathe through a wet cloth soaked in substances that your lungs actively rebel against. You learn to take shallow breaths through your mouth, avoiding deep inhalation that could lead to the kind of lightheadedness that might result in falling face first into your work environment. The walls of the cesspit tell their own story as you work at their base. Years of use have stained the stone in patterns that create an inadvertent archaeological record of the neighborhood's digestive history. Medieval masons built these structures to last, but they couldn't have anticipated the chemical environment they'd be subjected to. The mortar shows signs of erosion from the acidic nature of the waste, creating a texture that's both rough and slippery, perfect for losing your grip at the worst possible moment. Historians still argue whether medieval communities understood the health implications of cesspit construction, but working in one makes it clear that somebody knew enough to build them away from water sources and dwelling areas. The engineering shows evidence of practical knowledge about waste management that modern sanitation workers would recognize even if the execution was limited by available technology and materials. As you fill your first bucket and signal for it to be hauled up, You realize you've crossed a threshold that can't be uncrossed. You're no longer someone who works near waste. You're someone who works in waste surrounded by it, breathing it, feeling it seep through your protective clothing. This isn't just a job anymore. It's a transformative experience that will fundamentally change how you exist in the world. The pit has claimed you as surely as if you'd signed a contract written in substances that contracts were never meant to be written in. The air in the cesspit isn't really air anymore. It's a toxic cocktail of gases that turns every breath into a conscious negotiation with your own survival instincts. Your lungs, which have faithfully served you through years of honest labor, suddenly feel like they're staging a revolt against your career choices. The methane rises from the decomposing waste like invisible serpents, creating an atmosphere so thick with poison that you begin to understand why medieval people believed in miasma theory, the idea that disease traveled through bad air. They weren't entirely wrong. They just didn't have the scientific vocabulary to explain that some air is genuinely trying to kill you. Hydrogen sulfide provides the signature smell that will follow you for the rest of your life, a scent so distinctive that you'll recognize it instantly decades from now, assuming you survive that long. It's the gas responsible for the rotten egg odor that makes people gag from a distance. But down here in the pit, concentrated and inescapable, it becomes something more sinister than mere unpleasantness. Your supervisor warned you that hydrogen sulfide can cause olfactory fatigue. Your nose simply gives up trying to process the smell, which sounds like a blessing, until you realize that losing your sense of smell also means losing one of your primary warning systems for dangerous gas concentrations. The methane presents hazards beyond just making you dizzy and nauseous. This colorless, odorless gas accumulates in low-lying areas, like cesspits, creating pockets of potential disaster that could turn your oil lamp into an improvised explosive device. Medieval Gong farmers learned through tragic experience to watch their flame carefully. A flickering light often indicated gas buildup that could lead to underground explosions. You find yourself staring at your lamp's flame with the intensity of someone reading their own fortune, because in a very real sense, that's exactly what you're doing. Carbon dioxide, heavier than air, settles at the bottom of the pit, where you're working creating dead zones, where breathing becomes nearly impossible. It's an invisible threat that can overcome you, gradually making you lightheaded and confused before you realize what's happening. Your supervisor taught you to recognize the warning signs: difficulty concentrating, shortness of breath, and the sudden urge to sit down and rest. But recognizing symptoms while breathing poison gas requires mental clarity that the poison gas is actively working to destroy. It's like trying to solve a puzzle while someone gradually removes pieces of your brain. The ammonia compounds released by decomposing waste attack your respiratory system with chemical aggression that makes tear gas seem friendly by comparison. Your eyes stream constantly, not from emotion, but from chemical irritation that would make onion cutting seem like aromatherapy. The ammonia burns your nasal passages and throat, creating a sensation like breathing liquid fire mixed with the contents of a latrine. Medieval medical understanding couldn't explain why Gong farmers developed respiratory problems, but they could certainly observe the correlation between waste work and chronic coughing, wheezing, and premature death. Your breathing becomes shallow and rapid as your body tries to minimize exposure while still maintaining consciousness, a biological compromise that leaves you perpetually on the edge of panic. Each inhalation feels like swallowing poison, which isn't entirely inaccurate given the bacterial content of the air you're breathing. The decomposing waste releases particles of organic matter that you're now inhaling, creating an intimate biological connection with the digestive products of people you've never met, but whose intestinal bacteria are now colonizing your respiratory system. The dizziness hits in waves, making the already treacherous footing of the cesspit floor even more dangerous. Your balance compromised by toxic gas exposure turns simple movements into potential disasters. Historians still argue whether medieval Gong farmers understood the connection between gas exposure and accidents, but the correlation was clear enough that experienced workers developed techniques for rapid retreat when breathing became impossible. The problem is that rapid retreat from a 6-foot deep pit filled with waste while dizzy from gas exposure is somewhat easier to describe than to execute. Your lamp begins to flicker ominously, not from wind, but from insufficient oxygen to maintain proper combustion. This serves as both a warning sign and a source of additional anxiety. If there's not enough oxygen to keep a flame burning properly, there's definitely not enough to keep your brain functioning at full capacity. You're essentially working in an environment that's actively trying to render you unconscious while surrounded by substances that unconsciousness would place you in direct contact with. It's like a medieval version of extreme sports, except instead of impressing anyone, you're just trying to avoid suffocating in sewage. The gases create a layered atmosphere within the pit, with different concentrations at different heights. What you're breathing at foot level is different from what exists at waist height, creating microenvironments of toxicity that change as you move around your work area. Medieval workers couldn't measure gas concentrations scientifically, but they developed an intuitive understanding of how to position themselves for optimal survival while still accomplishing the job. This knowledge was passed down through generations of people who learned that certain positions in the pit were marginally less likely to kill you. Your body's natural warning systems are simultaneously overloaded and undermined by the toxic environment. The urge to vomit competes with the need to keep breathing, while your increasingly impaired judgment makes decisions about safety progressively more difficult. You're operating heavy tools while cognitively impaired by gases that medieval science couldn't identify, but could certainly observe the effects of. It's occupational health and safety at its most brutally primitive. You learn what's dangerous by discovering what kills people and hope you're observant enough to avoid repeating their mistakes. Working alone in a cesspit isn't just inadvisable, it's practically suicidal, which explains why gong farming operates on a buddy system that would make military units proud. Your team consists of 2 or 3 other men who share your combination of desperation and questionable judgment, creating a fellowship forged by mutual necessity and the shared understanding that your survival depends entirely on watching each other's backs. It's like having the world's most specialized support group, except instead of discussing feelings, you're coordinating waste removal strategies and taking turns breathing toxic fumes. The team hierarchy develops naturally based on experience, physical capability, and willingness to undertake specific aspects of the job that others find particularly objectionable. Your supervisor, weathered by years of exposure to both waste and social rejection, serves as the crew chief who coordinates assignments and maintains the delicate balance between productivity and keeping everyone alive. Medieval Gong farming crews developed their own internal culture complete with gallows, humor specialized vocabulary, and rituals that helped maintain morale while performing work that challenged the very concept of human dignity. The safety protocols that emerge from this teamwork aren't written down anywhere, they're passed along through oral tradition and hard earned experience. One person always remains above ground while others work in the pit, serving as both a spotter and emergency response team. This surface worker monitors the condition of those below watches for signs of gas exposure or physical distress and maintains the rope and pulley system that represents your primary lifeline to the world above. It's a responsibility that requires constant vigilance because the symptoms of toxic gas exposure can develop rapidly and impair judgment before the affected person realizes they're in danger. The rotation system for pit work reflects both practical necessity and basic human compassion. No one can work continuously in the toxic environment at the bottom of a cesspit without suffering serious health consequences, so teams develop schedules that distribute the most dangerous exposure among all members. Typically, workers spend 30 to 45 minutes in the pit before rotating to surface duties, allowing their bodies time to recover while maintaining continuous progress on the job. Historians still argue whether these rotation schedules were based on medical understanding or simply trial and error, but the practical result was a crude form of occupational health management. Communication becomes crucial when working in an environment where visibility is limited and toxic exposure can impair cognitive function. Your team develops a system of calls and signals that allow coordination between surface and pit workers, including specific warnings for gas buildup equipment problems and medical emergencies. The verbal shorthand that evolves includes terms for different types of waste consistency depth, measurements, and danger levels that wouldn't make sense to outsiders but represent essential survival information for people working in confined toxic spaces. The emotional support aspect of Team Gong farming proves almost as important as the practical safety benefits. Performing work that society considers disgusting and degrading while isolated from normal human contact creates psychological stresses that individual workers struggle to handle alone. Your teammates understand the unique challenges of the profession in ways that family members or former friends simply cannot. They've experienced the same social rejection, health risks, and existential questions about life choices that come with voluntary descent into humanity's waste stream. Equipment sharing and maintenance becomes a collective responsibility that reflects both economic necessity and practical survival requirements. Most gong farmers can't afford complete sets of specialized tools individually, so teams pool resources and maintain shared equipment that everyone's life depends on. The rope that pulls you out of the pit today might save your teammate's life tomorrow, creating interdependence that goes far beyond mere workplace cooperation. Medieval craftsmanship wasn't standardized, so maintaining and repairing specialized gong farming equipment required collective knowledge and skill. The trust required for effective team gong farming exceeds what most other medieval professions demanded. You're literally placing your life in the hands of people whose judgment might be impaired by the same toxic exposures that are affecting you. When someone signals that they're experiencing symptoms of gas poisoning, the team must react immediately and decisively, even if that means abandoning work and losing income. This creates bonds of mutual dependence that transcend normal workplace relationships. You're not just colleagues, you're survival partners in an environment actively trying to kill you. Emergency procedures develop through necessity rather than formal training. Since medieval occupational safety manuals didn't exactly cover cesspit rescue techniques, teams learn to recognize the signs of serious gas exposure, how to extract an unconscious worker from a confined space filled with waste, and basic first aid for someone who has been overcome by toxic fumes. These skills are acquired through experience that often involves watching teammates suffer the consequences of inadequate safety measures, creating institutional knowledge built on preventable tragedies. The social dynamics within Gong farming teams reflect the broader isolation of the profession from mainstream society. These men become your primary social contacts, the only people who understand your daily reality and don't cross the street when they see you coming. Friendships formed in cesspits carry emotional weight that extends far beyond work hours, creating support networks for people who have been essentially exiled from normal community life. You're not just working together, you're surviving together in a profession that tests both physical endurance and psychological resilience. The shared meals and brief rest periods between jobs become important social rituals that maintain team cohesion and morale. Even these simple interactions are complicated by the persistent odor that marks all Gong farmers making normal social activities, like visiting taverns or attending community events, practically impossible. Your team creates its own social space where the stigma of the profession doesn't exist, where conversation can focus on topics other than waste management, and where human dignity can be maintained despite working in conditions that challenge the very concept. The rotation system within your Gong farming crew operates on a hierarchy of horror that would make Dante reconsider his classification of hell's various circles. Not all aspects of waste removal are created equal. Some jobs are merely terrible, while others transcend ordinary suffering and enter realms of experience that challenge your faith in a benevolent universe. The most dreaded assignment involves becoming the cesspit diver, the team member who descends deepest into the waste and handles the most concentrated toxic and psychologically damaging aspects of the job. This position rotates among crew members based on a combination of seniority, physical capability, and what can only be described as cosmic misfortune. The newest team member, which happens to be you, typically finds themselves pressured into accepting the most hazardous assignments through a combination of economic necessity and social dynamics that reflect the broader medieval hierarchy. Experienced Gong farmers have literally paid their dues in blood, sweat, and substances that shouldn't exist in nature, earning the right to assign the worst tasks to newcomers who lack the leverage to refuse. It's a hazing process that doubles as practical training, ensuring that fresh recruits understand exactly what they've committed to, while veteran workers preserve what remains of their health for as long as possible. The physical demands of different positions within the team create natural divisions based on age, strength, and accumulated damage from years of toxic exposure. Younger workers possess the physical resilience needed for pit diving, while older crew members serve in support roles that require experience and judgment rather than the ability to shovel waste while breathing poison. This system acknowledges the brutal reality that gong farming is a profession with a limited shelf life. Workers age out not through retirement, but through physical breakdown that makes continued pit work impossible. The psychological pressure to accept dangerous assignments reflects broader medieval attitudes about social hierarchy and individual expendability. As the newest and most desperate member of an already desperate profession, you lack the social capital to negotiate better working conditions or refuse particularly hazardous tasks. Your teammates, while not unsympathetic to your situation, understand that survival in this profession requires a certain ruthless pragmatism about who undertakes which risks. Everyone started at the bottom of the rotation system, and those who survived long enough earned the right to delegate the worst jobs to someone else. The cesspit diver position involves descending to the deepest levels of waste accumulation where the oldest and most decomposed material has settled into substances that defy classification by any system of medieval natural philosophy. This material has achieved a consistency and toxicity that represents the absolute nadir of human waste management challenges. Working at these depths means exposure to concentrated gases, prolonged contact with the most dangerous bacterial environments, and physical demands that push human endurance beyond reasonable limits. The selection process for rotation assignments operates through a combination of informal negotiation, physical assessment, and occasionally outright intimidation that reflects the desperate circumstances driving everyone's participation in the profession. Experienced workers use their seniority to avoid the most dangerous tasks, while newer members lack the leverage to refuse assignments that could seriously damage their health or kill them outright. Historians still argue whether this system represented rational resource allocation or simply the exploitation of desperation, but the practical result was that the most vulnerable workers faced the greatest risks. The equipment allocation follows the same hierarchical principles that govern task assignment, with senior team members claiming the best maintained tools, while newcomers receive whatever remains available. Your shovel might have a loose handle, your rope might show signs of wear, and your protective gear might have seen better decades. But complaining about equipment quality isn't really an option when you're the person everyone expects to volunteer for the most dangerous work. Medieval craftsmanship varied wildly in quality, and gong farming equipment represented whatever tools desperate people could afford or salvage. The mentorship aspect of the rotation system provides crucial training that could mean the difference between survival and becoming a permanent part of the waste management system you're supposed to be cleaning. Experienced workers share knowledge about recognizing dangerous gas concentrations, identifying unstable pit walls, and managing the physical demands of extended exposure to toxic environments. This information isn't written down anywhere. It's transmitted through observation, oral instruction, and occasionally the hard-learned lessons of watching teammates make fatal mistakes. The economic incentives of rotation assignments create complex dynamics within teams, as the most dangerous positions often command slightly higher pay that reflects the increased risk and skill required. As the cesspit diver, You might earn a few extra coins that represent compensation for accepting assignments that could shorten your lifespan or cause permanent health damage. These financial incentives ensure that someone will always volunteer for the worst jobs while creating internal competition among workers who desperately need every available coin. The social dynamics of task rotation extend beyond mere work assignment to encompass questions of loyalty, solidarity, and survival within a profession that isolates workers from mainstream society. Your willingness to accept dangerous assignments affects your standing within the team and influences how much support you can expect when you eventually need assistance. Medieval Gong farming crews developed their own codes of mutual obligation that balanced individual survival instincts against collective responsibility for team welfare. The long-term consequences of consistently accepting the most hazardous rotation assignments become apparent through observation of veteran workers whose health has been systematically destroyed by years of exposure to the worst aspects of the profession. The cesspit divers of previous generations serve as living warnings about the cumulative effects of voluntary descent into toxic environments, their compromised health, and shortened lifespans representing the price paid for economic survival in a society that offered few alternatives for people without skills land or social connections. The physics of moving human waste defies every assumption you've ever made about the relationship between matter and gravity, revealing that excrement possesses unique properties that seem specifically designed to make your life miserable. Each bucket you fill weighs significantly more than its volume would suggest, as if the waste has achieved a density that violates the normal laws of medieval natural philosophy. The water content alone makes each container feel like you're lifting liquid lead, but the solid matter suspended throughout creates an uneven distribution of weight that shifts unpredictably as you attempt to carry it up the ladder and out of the cesspit. The technique for lifting waste-filled buckets requires a complete reimagining of every lifting method you've learned through years of manual labor. Standard approaches to heavy lifting assume that your cargo will maintain consistent weight distribution and won't actively fight against your efforts to move it. Waste, however, behaves more like a malevolent liquid that deliberately redistributes itself at the worst possible moments, turning routine lifting into an exercise in dynamic balance that would challenge experienced acrobats. Your back muscles, already strained from shoveling in awkward positions, must now adapt to supporting loads that seem to increase in weight during transport. The bucket carrying process becomes an exercise in applied medieval engineering that would impress university scholars if they weren't too refined to acknowledge that such challenges exist. You learn to grip the handle with both hands, keeping the container close to your body to minimize the leverage working against your spine, while simultaneously managing the rope that serves as your safety line during the climb out of the pit. The coordination required resembles an elaborate dance, except your dance partner weighs 40 pounds and contains substances that shouldn't exist in nature. The ladder climb with a full bucket represents perhaps the most physically demanding aspect of Gong farming, combining the challenges of rock climbing with the additional complexity of carrying cargo that actively resists transportation. Medieval ladder construction wasn't standardized, so each job site presents unique challenges, in terms of rung spacing, wood quality, and structural integrity. You're essentially rock climbing while carrying a bucket of liquid that sloshes with every movement, threatening to unbalance you or spill its contents on your face as you struggle upward toward fresh air and solid ground. The spillage prevention techniques you develop represent crucial skills that directly impact both your safety and your standing within the community. Waste spilled during transport doesn't just create cleanup problems, it can contaminate water sources, spread disease, and generate the kind of public relations disasters that get Gong farming crews banned from working in particular neighborhoods. Your reputation as a competent waste handler depends partly on your ability to move full buckets without creating secondary disasters that remind the community exactly what you're doing while they sleep. The cart loading process requires strategic thinking about weight distribution and stability that would challenge medieval siege engineers. Each bucket must be positioned to maintain the cart's balance while preventing spillage during transport over uneven cobblestone streets. The medieval understanding of physics was limited, but Gong farmers developed practical knowledge about leverage balance and momentum that kept their cargo from becoming a public hazard during the journey to disposal sites. Loading techniques evolved through trial and error, with mistakes resulting in spectacular disasters that affected entire neighborhoods. The upper body strength required for continuous bucket hauling exceeds what most other medieval professions demanded, creating physical development that marks Gong farmers as distinctly as their persistent odor. Your shoulders, arms, and back develop the kind of muscular definition that comes from repeatedly lifting heavy, awkward loads under challenging conditions. Medieval people could identify Gong farmers by their distinctive build, powerful upper bodies, combined with the slightly hunched posture that develops from years of working in confined spaces while carrying substantial weight. The teamwork aspect of bucket transport becomes crucial during the most challenging phases of waste removal, when coordination between pit workers and surface crew determines both efficiency and safety. The person above ground must time their assistants perfectly helping to haul buckets up the final distance, while the climber maintains balance and control. This coordination requires communication, trust, and synchronized effort that reflects the specialized skills Gong farming teams developed through necessity rather than formal training. The rhythm you establish for continuous bucket transport becomes a survival mechanism that helps manage the physical and psychological demands of the work. Like medieval craftsmen who developed efficient patterns for repetitive tasks, Gong farmers create movement sequences that minimize energy expenditure while maintaining steady progress. This rhythm helps distract from the nature of what you're handling while ensuring that the job gets completed before toxic exposure becomes life-threatening. Historians still argue whether medieval communities understood the engineering challenges involved in waste transport, but the practical solutions developed by Gong farming crews demonstrate sophisticated understanding of mechanical principles applied to uniquely challenging circumstances. The techniques for moving heavy, unstable loads through confined spaces while maintaining safety and preventing environmental contamination represent genuine innovations in medieval waste management technology. The long-term physical consequences of repeated heavy lifting in toxic environments become apparent through observation of veteran Gong farmers whose bodies bear the accumulated damage of years spent hauling substances that were never meant to be lifted repeatedly. Joint problems, back injuries, and muscle strain create chronic health issues that compound the respiratory and infectious diseases associated with toxic exposure, making gong farming a profession that systematically destroys workers' physical capabilities through the very actions required to perform the job successfully. The journey to the lay stalls, those massive waste dumps located strategically outside town walls, feels like a pilgrimage in reverse, carrying your unholy cargo away from civilization toward designated zones where society deposits what it cannot bear to acknowledge. Your cart rumbles over cobblestones with a distinctive sound that announces your profession to anyone within hearing distance, the wheels creating a rhythmic percussion accompanied by the occasional slosh of liquid waste that has somehow achieved the ability to move independently of your transportation efforts. Medieval urban planning placed these disposal sites as downwind and downstream from populated areas, reflecting practical knowledge about waste management that modern sanitation engineers would recognize even if the execution was limited by available technology. The lay stalls themselves represent medieval waste management on an industrial scale that would horrify modern environmental scientists. These aren't simple dumping grounds, but carefully engineered disposal sites designed to contain and process the collective waste output of entire communities. The largest lay stalls could accommodate waste from thousands of residents, creating artificial hills of decomposing matter that served as monuments to human digestive productivity. Medieval authorities understood that improper waste disposal could contaminate water supplies and spread disease, so lay stall construction followed specific guidelines about location drainage and capacity management. The approach to your destination reveals the full scope of medieval waste management challenges through landscape features that couldn't exist in any other context. The road leading to the lay stalls shows evidence of countless cartwheels carrying similar loads, creating ruts worn specifically by waste transport vehicles. Vegetation along the route grows with unusual vigor, benefiting from nutrients that leak from passing carts, while certain plants seem to thrive in soil that has been systematically contaminated by decades of waste transportation. It's an accidentally created ecosystem that demonstrates both the environmental impact and the surprising fertility potential of human waste. The other gong farming crews you encounter during your journey create a strange sense of professional community among people who work in society's shadow. These brief meetings represent some of your only social contact with people who understand your daily reality without crossing themselves or holding their breath when you approach. The informal communication between crews includes sharing information about particularly challenging job sites, warning about dangerous working conditions, and occasionally coordinating schedules to avoid overwhelming the lay stalls with simultaneous deliveries from multiple teams. The lay stall workers who manage these disposal sites represent another specialized branch of medieval waste management people whose full-time job involves organizing and processing the waste that gong farmers deliver throughout the night. These workers possess knowledge about waste decomposition, site management, and disposal techniques that complement your skills in waste removal. They understand which areas of the lay stall can accommodate different types of waste, how to maintain proper drainage to prevent groundwater contamination, and techniques for accelerating decomposition that reduce the volume of accumulated material. The unloading process requires coordination between your team and the lay stall workers to ensure efficient disposal while maintaining safety protocols that protect everyone involved. The lay stalls are equipped with designated dumping areas, drainage channels, and access routes that facilitate rapid unloading while preventing cross contamination between different waste sources. Medieval engineering applied to waste management created surprisingly sophisticated systems for processing large volumes of material that would challenge modern waste management facilities operating without mechanical equipment. The scale of waste accumulation at major lay stalls provides perspective on medieval urban populations and consumption patterns that historical records rarely document directly. The volume of material arriving each night represents the digestive output of communities whose size can be estimated through their waste production. Historians still argue whether lay stall capacity reflected actual population numbers or simply the efficiency of waste collection systems, but the physical evidence of these sites offers unique insights into medieval and urban demographics that complement official records. The environmental impact of lay stall operations becomes apparent through changes in local soil composition, water table levels, and vegetation patterns that extend far beyond the immediate disposal areas. Medieval communities lacked modern understanding of groundwater contamination and long-term environmental consequences, but they developed practical knowledge about site selection and drainage that minimized immediate health hazards. The placement of lay stalls reflected empirical observations about wind patterns, water flow, and soil composition that protected inhabited areas from the worst effects of large-scale waste disposal. The economics of lay stall operations reveal the financial infrastructure that supported medieval waste management systems, including fees charged for disposal services, employment opportunities for workers who specialized in site management, and occasional revenue from selling processed waste as fertilizer. These facilities required significant initial investment in excavation drainage systems and access roads, plus ongoing maintenance costs that were offset through user fees and municipal support. The lay stalls represented substantial public works projects that rivaled other medieval infrastructure investments. The social geography of lay stall locations reflects medieval attitudes about waste management and community planning that prioritized protecting wealthy neighborhoods while concentrating environmental hazards in areas inhabited by people with limited political influence. The placement of these facilities followed patterns that would be familiar to modern environmental justice advocates, with disposal sites located away from areas where influential citizens might object to their presence. Medieval waste management was already demonstrating the tendency to export environmental problems to communities with less social power. The return journey from the lay stalls provides brief respite from the weight of your cargo while offering time to contemplate the cyclical nature of your profession. Tomorrow night, you'll return to collect another load of waste, beginning the process again in an endless cycle that connects individual human biology to community-scale infrastructure management. The empty cart rolls more easily over the cobblestones, but your body carries the accumulated fatigue of another night spent moving substances that challenge both physical endurance and psychological resilience. You're heading back toward town to sleep during daylight hours, preparing for another night of essential work that society requires but prefers to forget. The debate over whether your cargo constitutes valuable fertilizer or dangerous poison reveals medieval society's complicated relationship with human waste and its potential agricultural applications. Some farmers eagerly purchase processed waste from the lay stalls, recognizing its nitrogen rich composition and proven ability to enhance crop yields in ways that animal manure simply cannot match. These agricultural entrepreneurs understand that human waste, properly aged and composted, can transform marginal farmland into productive soil that supports larger harvests and more profitable operations. Medieval agricultural treatises occasionally mention human waste as a fertilizer option, though they tend to discuss it in euphemistic terms that avoid offending readers' sensibilities. The farmers who embrace human waste fertilization represent a pragmatic approach to agriculture that prioritizes results over social acceptability. These are typically smaller landholders who cannot afford large quantities of animal manure or who farm marginal land that requires intensive soil amendment to produce viable crops. They've observed that fields treated with properly processed human waste produce larger vegetables, more abundant grain harvests, and generally healthier looking crops than those treated with conventional fertilizers alone. Economic necessity drives their willingness to use materials that wealthier farmers might reject based on social prejudices rather than agricultural effectiveness. The processing techniques that transform raw waste into usable fertilizer require specialized knowledge about decomposition, soil chemistry, and timing that medieval farmers developed through trial and error rather than formal education. The waste must be aged for specific periods to allow dangerous bacteria to die off, while beneficial decomposition processes convert organic matter into forms that plants can absorb effectively. This aging process typically takes several months, during which the material is turned mixed with other organic matter and monitored for signs of proper decomposition. Medieval farmers couldn't test for specific pathogens, but they developed practical indicators for determining when waste had been processed sufficiently for safe agricultural use. The health risks associated with using human waste as fertilizer were partially understood by medieval agricultural practitioners who developed guidelines about crop selection application timing and handling procedures that reduced but didn't eliminate the dangers of contamination. Vegetables that would be eaten raw were generally avoided when using human waste fertilizer, while crops like grains that underwent cooking before consumption were considered safer applications. Medieval farmers also learned to avoid applying fresh waste directly to crops, understanding that some form of processing was necessary, even if they couldn't explain the scientific principles involved. The social stigma attached to using human waste fertilizer reflects broader medieval attitudes about purity contamination and social hierarchy that complicated what should have been straightforward agricultural decisions. Farmers who used human waste fertilizer risked social judgment from neighbors who considered the practice disgusting, even when those same neighbors might purchase the resulting crops without knowing their origin. This created a somewhat hypocritical market dynamic where the social acceptability of the practice depended largely on maintaining ignorance about agricultural methods rather than evaluating their effectiveness or safety. The transportation and application challenges of using human waste as fertilizer require specialized equipment and techniques that differ significantly from conventional manure handling. Human waste has different consistency, odor intensity, and spreading characteristics than animal manure, necessitating modified tools and application methods that minimize worker exposure while ensuring even distribution across fields. Medieval farmers who specialized in human waste fertilization developed their own techniques for dilution mixing and application that reflected practical knowledge gained through experience with this unique agricultural input. The economic calculations involved in purchasing human waste fertilizer versus other soil amendments reveal the complex cost-benefit analysis that medieval farmers performed when evaluating agricultural investment options. Human waste was typically less expensive than animal manure, partly because of its social stigma and partly because of the abundant supply generated by urban populations. For farmers operating on tight margins, the economic advantages of human waste fertilizer could outweigh the social and health risks, especially when proper processing techniques reduce the most serious dangers associated with its use. Historians still argue whether medieval communities had systematic knowledge about the disease transmission, risks associated with using human waste as fertilizer. But practical evidence suggests that farmers developed empirical guidelines that reduced contamination without fully understanding the underlying microbiology. These guidelines included recommendations about crop selection, application timing, and processing methods that reflected accumulated experience rather than scientific theory. The knowledge was transmitted through agricultural communities as practical wisdom rather than formal instruction. The seasonal aspects of human waste fertilizer use reflect both agricultural timing requirements and practical considerations about waste availability and processing schedules. Spring application allowed the material to work into soil before planting, while fall application provided time for winter processing that reduced pathogens and improved soil integration. Medieval farmers coordinated with Gong farmers and lay stall operators to ensure adequate supplies during optimal application periods, creating agricultural relationships that connected urban waste management to rural food production. The crop yield improvements, documented by farmers using human waste fertilizer, demonstrate its genuine agricultural value, despite the social and health complications associated with its use. Fields treated with properly processed human waste consistently produce larger harvests than those using conventional fertilization methods, alone validating the agricultural benefits that motivated farmers to accept the risks and social stigma. These productivity gains were particularly important for subsistence farmers whose survival depended on maximizing yields from limited acreage. The regional variations in human waste fertilizer acceptance reflect different cultural attitudes, agricultural traditions, and economic pressures that influenced farming communities' willingness to adopt controversial but effective soil amendment practices. Some areas developed thriving markets for processed human waste, while others rejected it entirely based on cultural taboos or religious prohibitions. These regional differences created agricultural advantages for farmers willing to use effective but socially stigmatized fertilization methods. Your body becomes a walking laboratory for every pathogen, parasite, and bacterial infection that medieval medical knowledge couldn't identify, but could certainly observe, devastating entire communities. The constant exposure to human waste creates an environment where your immune system faces challenges that would overwhelm modern antibiotics, turning you into a living experiment in how many diseases one person can survive simultaneously. Medieval physicians recognized that Gong farmers suffered from distinctive health problems, but their understanding of disease transmission was limited to observational correlation rather than scientific explanation of how microscopic organisms were systematically colonizing your digestive tract, respiratory system, and every other biological function you once took for granted. The intestinal parasites that take up residence in your body represent a diverse ecosystem of organisms that treat your digestive system like prime real estate in a medieval urban planning disaster. Roundworms, tapeworms, and various other creatures whose names medieval medicine couldn't pronounce establish permanent colonies that compete for the nutrients you consume, leaving you perpetually malnourished despite eating regularly. These parasites reproduce with enthusiasm that would impress medieval rabbit farmers, creating internal populations that affect everything from your energy levels to your cognitive function. The symptoms, chronic fatigue, digestive problems, and gradual weight loss develop so gradually that you might not realize you're hosting a biological convention until the delegates have established permanent residence. The bacterial infections that flourish in the moist, contaminated environment of your work clothes and equipment create skin conditions that medieval medicine classified under the broad category of unpleasant and probably your fault somehow. Your hands, despite protective leather gloves, develop persistent infections around minor cuts and abrasions that refuse to heal properly in the bacterial paradise you work in daily. Medieval understanding of antiseptic practices was limited, so these infections often spread and worsen, creating chronic health problems that compound the other occupational hazards of your profession. The respiratory diseases that develop from breathing toxic gases and airborne particles represent perhaps the most serious long-term health consequences of Gong farming. Your lungs, designed to process clean medieval air that was already questionable by modern standards, must now handle concentrated doses of methane, hydrogen, sulfide ammonia compounds, and various organic particles that create breathing problems ranging from chronic coughing to complete respiratory failure. Medieval physicians observed that Gong farmers developed distinctive breathing difficulties, but they attributed these problems to bad humors rather than understanding the toxic exposure that was systematically destroying your respiratory system. The eye infections and vision problems that result from constant exposure to ammonia-rich environments create additional health challenges that affect both your work performance and your general quality of life. The persistent irritation from toxic gases causes chronic inflammation that medieval medicine couldn't treat effectively, leading to progressive vision deterioration that makes the dangerous work of Gong farming even more hazardous. Your eyes water constantly, not from emotion, but from chemical irritation that serves as a daily reminder of the toxic environment you're voluntarily subjecting yourself to for economic survival. The skin diseases that develop from prolonged contact with waste-contaminated clothing and equipment create visible markers of your profession that persist even during your off hours. Medieval understanding of dermatology was primitive, so the rashes, lesions, and chronic irritation that mark Gong farmers were considered occupational inevitabilities rather than treatable conditions. These skin problems often became infected, creating additional health complications that reflected the generally unsanitary conditions of medieval life, amplified by the particularly challenging environment of waste management work. The neurological effects of chronic toxic gas exposure manifest in ways that medieval medicine couldn't explain but could certainly observe among long-term Gong farmers. Prolonged exposure to methane and hydrogen sulfide can cause cognitive impairment, memory problems, and behavioral changes that affect your ability to perform even the basic functions of daily life. Medieval communities noted that veteran Gong farmers often seemed addled or confused, but they attributed these symptoms to moral failings rather than understanding the brain damage caused by repeated exposure to neurotoxic gases. Historians still argue whether medieval communities understood the connection between Gong farming and shortened life expectancy, but the correlation was clear enough that few people voluntarily entered the profession unless driven by absolute desperation. The combination of toxic exposure, infectious disease, physical injury, and chronic malnutrition created health challenges that exceeded what medieval medicine could address effectively. Gong farmers typically aged rapidly and died young, their bodies worn out by occupational hazards that modern occupational safety regulations were specifically designed to prevent. The malnutrition that results from parasitic infections and digestive system damage compounds all other health problems while reducing your body's ability to fight off new infections or recover from injuries. Medieval nutrition was already marginal for working class people, but Gong farmers faced additional challenges from organisms that competed for whatever nutrients they managed to consume. This created a cycle of declining health where each problem made you more vulnerable to additional complications. The social isolation imposed by your profession extends to medical care, as many physicians prefer not to treat patients whose occupational exposure might spread contagious diseases to other clients or medical practitioners. Medieval medical knowledge about contagion was limited but sufficient to recognize that Gong farmers represented higher risk patients who might transmit unknown diseases through contact. This medical discrimination meant that health problems often went untreated until they became severe enough to threaten your ability to work. The cumulative effect of multiple health problems creates a biological burden that accelerates aging and reduces life expectancy in ways that medieval communities could observe but couldn't quantify scientifically. Your body becomes a case study in occupational disease that demonstrates the human cost of essential services that society requires but prefers not to acknowledge. The health problems you develop serve as a living reminder that civilization's basic functions often depend on people willing to sacrifice their physical well-being for economic survival. The transformation from productive community member to social pariah happens gradually, then suddenly, as the persistent stench of your profession seeps into every aspect of your existence and marks you as permanently as any medieval brand or scarlet letter. People who once greeted you with casual familiarity now cross streets when they see you approaching their faces, contorting into expressions of disgust that cut deeper than any insult could. Medieval society operated on intricate networks of social connection and mutual obligation, but your profession places you outside these systems, creating an isolation so complete that you begin to question whether you still qualify as a full member of the human community. The smell that follows you transcends normal human experience of unpleasant odors, achieving a level of olfactory offense that seems to violate natural laws about how bad things can smell while still permitting consciousness. No amount of scrubbing with harsh medieval soap removes the scent that is bonded with your skin hair and clothing at a molecular level that defies conventional cleaning methods. Medieval people understood perfumes and aromatic herbs as weapons against bad smells, but your occupational aroma represents a challenge that overwhelms even the most determined efforts at scent management. You've become a walking advertisement for your profession, identifiable from distances that allow people ample time to plan their avoidance strategies. The children who once ran freely through the streets now flee when they see you coming, their parents having taught them that proximity to gong farmers brings disease, moral contamination, and probably divine judgment for associating with people who voluntarily work in excrement. Medieval childhood education included practical lessons about avoiding various social hazards, and gong farmers ranked alongside lepers, beggars, and other categories of people that respectable families kept their children away from. The innocent cruelty of children who haven't learned to hide their revulsion behind polite society's thin veneer of civility provides daily reminders of exactly how far you've fallen in the community's estimation. The merchants who once accepted your business with routine courtesy now demand payment in advance and handle your coins with obvious reluctance, as if money touched by gong farmer hands might carry contamination that could spread to other customers or inventory. Medieval commerce operated on personal relationships and community trust, but your profession places you outside normal commercial interactions, creating economic disadvantages that compound the social isolation. Some merchants refuse to serve you entirely, forcing you to conduct business through intermediaries or travel to neighboring communities where your reputation hasn't preceded you. The religious implications of your profession create spiritual isolation that affects your relationship with both formal church institutions and personal faith practices. Medieval Christianity emphasized purity and cleanliness as reflections of spiritual condition, making your occupation seem like evidence of moral failing rather than economic necessity. Church attendance becomes complicated when other parishioners obviously struggle with the conflict between Christian charity and their natural revulsion at sharing enclosed spaces with someone whose smell triggers involuntary gagging. Some clergy show compassion for your circumstances, while others suggest that your profession represents divine punishment for unspecified sins. The taverns and alehouses that serve as primary social centers for working-class medieval communities become effectively off-limits when your presence empties rooms faster than fire alarms. Medieval social life revolved around communal drinking and conversation, but your occupational aroma creates an atmosphere that makes normal socializing impossible. Even when proprietors don't explicitly ban you, the mass exodus of other customers makes your patronage economically problematic for establishments that depend on creating pleasant environments for social interaction. The marriage prospects for Gong farmers represent perhaps the most profound aspect of social ostracism, as few families want their daughters associated with men whose profession carries implications about social status, life expectancy, and genetic contamination of potential grandchildren. Medieval marriage involved complex negotiations about family reputation and economic prospects, both of which suffer severely when one party's occupation involves voluntary immersion in human waste. The isolation extends beyond personal relationships to affect your family's social standing, creating multi-generational consequences for career choices driven by immediate economic desperation. Historians still argue whether medieval communities intentionally designed the social ostracism of Gong farmers as a form of social control, or whether it developed naturally from practical concerns about disease transmission and moral contamination. The systematic nature of the exclusion suggests deliberate social engineering that maintained essential services while ensuring that workers understood the permanent costs of accepting such employment. The ostracism served multiple functions, encouraging people to avoid the profession if possible, while creating clear social boundaries that protected community members from contamination fears. The psychological effects of sustained social rejection create mental health challenges that medieval medicine couldn't address, and that compound the physical health problems associated with toxic exposure. Living as a social pariah requires psychological resilience that exceeds what most people possess, naturally leading to depression, anger, and behavioral changes that further reinforce the community's negative perception of Gong farmers. The isolation becomes self-perpetuating as social rejection creates defensive behaviors that make reintegration increasingly difficult. The paradox of simultaneous dependence and rejection creates cognitive dissonance that affects both Gong farmers and the communities they serve. Medieval townspeople understood intellectually that Gong farmers provided essential services that prevented disease outbreaks and maintained basic sanitation, but emotional responses to the profession overwhelmed rational appreciation for its necessity. This creates a social dynamic where communities systematically dehumanize the people who perform services that make civilized life possible. The coping mechanisms that develop among socially ostracized Gong farmers include forming alternative social networks with other outcasts, developing philosophical frameworks that reframe their work as noble service, despite social rejection, and occasionally embracing their pariah status as a form of rebellion against hypocritical social norms. Medieval society created numerous categories of social outcasts, and Gong farmers found common cause with other stigmatized groups who understood the experience of providing essential services while being treated as less than fully human. The specter of accidental death haunts every moment of your working life, transforming routine tasks into potential death scenarios that would challenge medieval philosophers contemplating the absurdity of human existence. Drowning in excrement represents the ultimate occupational hazard that combines physical danger with existential horror, creating mortality risks that no other medieval profession quite matches for sheer grotesque tragedy. The structural integrity of cesspit walls, compromised by years of exposure to acidic waste and moisture, can collapse without warning, trapping workers in spaces that become liquid tombs filled with the collective digestive output of entire neighborhoods. The physics of drowning in human waste differs significantly from drowning in water, involving substances with viscosity and density that make normal swimming motions ineffective, while creating suction effects that actively pull victims deeper into the muck. Medieval understanding of fluid dynamics was limited, but Gong farmers developed practical knowledge about waste behavior that included recognition of dangerous consistency patterns that could trap workers who lost their footing. The semi-liquid nature of age waste creates false surfaces that appear solid enough to support weight until disturbed, leading to sudden submersion in substances that resist normal escape techniques. The panic response to finding yourself sinking into human waste triggers psychological reactions that compound the physical challenges of escape creating scenarios where experienced workers might make fatal decisions under stress that they would avoid in calmer circumstances. Medieval knowledge of panic management was primarily theological rather than practical, so Gong farmers relied on experience and teamwork to prevent situations where toxic exposure, physical exhaustion, and mortal terror combined to create unsurvivable emergencies. The confined spaces of cesspits amplify panic responses while limiting escape options, making psychological preparedness as important as physical technique for survival. The rescue procedures for workers trapped in waste-filled confined spaces require coordination and equipment that medieval technology could provide, but that few communities bothered to develop systematically. Rope and pulley systems designed for emergency extraction must function in environments where visibility is limited, footing is unstable, and the urgency of the situation conflicts with safety requirements that prevent rescuers from becoming additional victims. Medieval emergency response was largely improvised rather than systematized, meaning that survival often depended on the quick thinking and courage of teammates rather than established protocols. The time constraints imposed by toxic gas exposure during rescue operations create additional pressure that forces difficult decisions about risk management when team members' lives hang in the balance. Methane and hydrogen sulfide concentrations that build up in confined waste spaces can overcome rescuers as quickly as victims, creating situations where attempted rescues become multiple casualty events that devastate entire Gong farming crews. Medieval understanding of toxic gas exposure was observational rather than scientific, but workers learned to recognize the symptoms that indicated when rescue attempts were likely to succeed versus when they would simply create additional fatalities. The equipment failures that contribute to accidental deaths reflect both the primitive state of medieval technology and the unique stresses that Gong farming equipment must withstand in corrosive high-stress environments. Rope that appears serviceable can fail under the combined stress of supporting human weight and resisting chemical degradation from waste exposure, while ladder rungs weakened by moisture and bacterial action can break at critical moments during emergency evacuations. Medieval craftsmanship varied wildly in quality, and Gong farming equipment represented whatever tools desperate workers could afford, rather than purpose-built safety equipment designed for hazardous environment applications. The seasonal variations in accidental death risks reflect changes in waste consistency, gas accumulation patterns, and structural stability that create different hazards throughout the year. Winter freezing can destabilize cesspit walls, while spring thaws create sudden changes in waste levels that catch workers unprepared for altered working conditions. Summer heat accelerates gas production and decomposition processes that increase toxic exposure risks, while autumn rains can suddenly flood work areas with runoff that transforms manageable waste into torrential hazards that sweep workers away. Historians still argue whether medieval communities kept systematic records of Gong farmer fatalities or simply accepted occupational deaths as inevitable costs of essential services that someone had to perform regardless of safety considerations. The social status of Gong farmers made their deaths less likely to be recorded in official documents, creating historical blind spots about the actual mortality rates associated with medieval waste management. The available evidence suggests that accidental deaths were common enough to be considered occupational hazards rather than tragic anomalies. The psychological impact of witnessing teammates' accidental deaths creates trauma that affects surviving crew members' ability to continue working in environments where similar accidents remain constant possibilities. Medieval understanding of psychological trauma was limited to religious frameworks that emphasized divine will rather than practical approaches to managing occupational stress and survivor guilt. Gong farmers who witnessed fatal accidents often developed drinking problems, behavioral changes, and risk-taking behaviors that increased their own chances of similar fates. The family consequences of accidental deaths in Gong farming reflect the broader social isolation of the profession, as communities that stigmatized workers during their lives rarely provided adequate support for widows and children left behind by occupational fatalities. Medieval social safety nets were primarily religious and family-based, but Gong farmers' social exclusion limited access to both forms of assistance. The economic desperation that drove men into Gong farming often left families with no alternative income sources when breadwinners died in workplace accidents. The investigation procedures for accidental deaths in Gong farming were typically perfunctory, reflecting both the low social status of victims and the general acceptance that such work inevitably involved life-threatening risks that workers accepted voluntarily. Medieval legal systems rarely pursued detailed investigations of occupational fatalities among stigmatized professions, particularly when the circumstances involved activities that respectable society preferred not to examine closely. The lack of systematic investigation meant that preventable accidents continued to occur without generating improvements in safety practices or equipment design. The odor that permeates your existence transcends the temporary inconvenience of unpleasant smells and achieves the status of a permanent personal characteristic that defines your social identity more completely than your name, family lineage, or any accomplishment you might achieve in other areas of life. Medieval people understood perfumes, aromatic herbs, and various masking agents as tools for managing offensive smells, but your occupational aroma represents a challenge that overwhelms conventional odor management techniques. With the relentless persistence of a scent that has bonded with your skin, hair, clothing, and personal possessions at a molecular level that medieval science couldn't explain but could certainly observe. The chemistry of waste-related odors involves volatile compounds that medieval natural philosophy couldn't identify, but that modern science recognizes as hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, skatol, and various organic acids that create smell profiles so distinctive and penetrating that they serve as olfactory fingerprints, identifying your profession from distances that allow people ample time to plan avoidance strategies. These compounds don't simply sit on surfaces waiting to be washed away. They integrate with organic materials like leather wool and human skin in ways that resist conventional cleaning methods and create permanent aromatic modifications that mark you as visibly as any physical deformity or social brand. The scrubbing rituals you develop represent desperate attempts to reclaim some semblance of social acceptability through increasingly aggressive personal hygiene practices that achieve modest temporary improvements while causing skin damage that creates additional health problems. Medieval soap was harsh by modern standards, containing lye and abrasive materials that could remove skin along with surface contamination, but even the most determined scrubbing sessions only reduce rather than eliminate the occupational aroma that has become your permanent personal signature. You develop techniques for layering different cleaning agents, using aromatic herbs, and timing your cleaning sessions to maximize the brief periods when your smell becomes merely unpleasant rather than overwhelming. The clothing challenges created by persistent occupational odors force difficult decisions about resource allocation when your limited income must cover both work clothes that will be systematically destroyed by toxic exposure and social clothes that might allow brief forays into normal community interactions. Medieval textile production was expensive and labor intensive, making clothing replacement a significant economic burden for people already earning marginal wages. The contamination spreads from work clothes to everything else in your living space, creating aromatic environments that mark your home as clearly as your person and extend the social isolation beyond working hours. The laundry techniques that medieval washerwomen developed for Gong farmer clothing represent specialized knowledge about odor removal that push the boundaries of available cleaning technology without achieving complete success. These women, often members of other stigmatized professions, understood that Gong farmer clothing required special handling, extended soaking periods, and aromatic additives that made the washing process more expensive and time consuming than normal laundry service. The persistent contamination meant that clothing never returned to truly clean condition, creating ongoing aromatic evidence of your profession that marked even your attempts at social respectability. The psychological adaptation to carrying permanent personal odor involves developing mental frameworks that allow you to function socially, despite constant reminders of your occupational stigma through involuntary physical reactions from everyone you encounter. Medieval understanding of psychology was rudimentary, but Gong farmers learned to interpret facial expressions, body language, and vocal tone changes that indicated how their presence affected others. This constant monitoring of social reactions creates psychological stress that compounds the physical health problems associated with toxic exposure while making normal social interactions feel like performance art designed to minimize offense. The seasonal variations in odor intensity reflect changes in weather, work conditions, and personal hygiene opportunities that create cyclical patterns of social acceptability throughout the year. Summer heat amplifies all organic odors while increasing perspiration that carries aromatic compounds more effectively, making warm weather particularly challenging for maintaining any pretense of social respectability. Winter cold reduces odor volatility but limits bathing opportunities, creating different aromatic challenges that affect your ability to participate in community activities that might provide relief from social isolation. Historians still argue whether medieval communities understood the connection between persistent odor and long term social exclusion, or simply accepted aromatic stigma as natural consequences of occupational choices that workers made voluntarily. The systematic nature of odor based discrimination suggests cultural understanding that smell served as reliable markers of social status and occupational identity that transcended temporary employment situations. Medieval society used aromatic cues as information about health morality and social position in ways that made scent based discrimination seem natural rather than constructed. The economic consequences of persistent personal odor extend beyond direct social rejection to affect your ability to negotiate prices, secure credit, and maintain business relationships that might provide alternative income sources or advancement opportunities. Medieval commerce operated on personal trust and social connections, both of which suffer when your physical presence triggers involuntary disgust responses that affect judgment about your reliability and character. The aromatic markers of your profession create business disadvantages that compound the social isolation while limiting economic opportunities for escaping the occupation. The coping strategies that develop around persistent personal odor include timing social interactions for optimal aromatic conditions, choosing social venues that minimize enclosed space interactions, and developing relationships with other stigmatized individuals who understand the challenges of carrying permanent markers of social unacceptability. Medieval communities included various categories of people marked by permanent physical or aromatic characteristics, and Gong farmers found solidarity with others who understood the experience of being immediately identifiable through involuntary physical markers. The intimate relationships affected by occupational odor create additional emotional challenges when potential romantic partners must weigh personal attraction against social consequences of association with someone whose smell marks them as permanently undesirable by community standards. Medieval marriage negotiations involved complex considerations about family reputation and social standing, both of which suffer when aromatic evidence of stigmatized employment affects not just the worker, but anyone who chooses to associate with them closely enough to share their aromatic environment. The contradictory relationship between your essential function and social status creates a philosophical puzzle that would challenge medieval scholars if they weren't too refined to acknowledge that such paradoxes exist within their carefully ordered understanding of divine hierarchy and social necessity. You perform work that literally prevents disease outbreaks, maintains basic sanitation standards, and keeps communities from drowning in their own waste. Yet society treats you as if your existence represents a moral failing rather than a vital service that makes civilized life possible. Medieval communities simultaneously depend on your labor and pretend you don't exist, creating cognitive dissonance that affects both your psychological well being and the broader social fabric that relies on systematic denial of its own fundamental dependencies. The public health benefits of your work become most apparent during periods when Gong farming services are disrupted by plague warfare or economic collapse, revealing the invisible infrastructure that normally prevents communities from confronting the consequences of inadequate waste management. Medieval medical understanding couldn't explain disease transmission scientifically, but practical observation demonstrated clear correlations between waste accumulation and illness outbreaks that made Gong farming services essential for community survival. The irony isn't lost on anyone with functioning brain cells that the people responsible for preventing plague are treated like they carry it personally. The economic value of waste management services exceeds what most medieval communities acknowledge through their payment structures, creating systematic undervaluation of labor that requires specialized skills, dangerous working conditions, and acceptance of permanent social stigma for the privilege of keeping everyone else healthy. Medieval guild systems protected skilled craftsmen through collective bargaining and quality standards, but Gong farmers operate outside normal labor organization structures, leaving individual workers vulnerable to exploitation by communities that need their services but prefer not to acknowledge fair compensation for essential work that no one else will perform. The municipal authorities who coordinate waste management services understand the practical necessity of maintaining adequate Gong farming capacity while navigating political pressures from residents who want efficient waste removal without paying realistic costs or acknowledging the human resources required for effective sanitation systems. Medieval urban planning included provisions for waste management that reflected practical knowledge about public health requirements, but the political implementation often involved compromises that prioritized social comfort over worker welfare or service sustainability. The seasonal demand variations for Gong farming services create economic instability that compounds the social isolation while making long-term financial planning impossible for workers whose income depends on community waste production cycles and weather conditions that affect work feasibility. Summer months typically generate more business due to increased waste decomposition and odor problems, while winter conditions can make waste removal technically impossible, creating feast or famine income patterns that reflect the specialized nature of the work rather than consistent community need for the services. The professional knowledge that Gong farmers accumulate about waste management, soil chemistry, and public health applications represents valuable expertise that medieval communities benefit from without acknowledging the intellectual contributions of workers they consider socially inferior. Your understanding of decomposition processes, drainage systems, and disease prevention techniques equals or exceeds what university-educated physicians know about practical health management, but social prejudices prevent recognition of Gong farmers as knowledgeable professionals rather than desperate manual laborers. The innovation in waste management techniques that emerges from practical experience with challenging working conditions demonstrates problem-solving capabilities and technical expertise that medieval society systematically undervalues due to the social stigma attached to the profession. Gong farmers develop improvements in equipment design, safety procedures, and efficiency methods that represent genuine contributions to medieval technology. But these innovations rarely receive acknowledgement or economic reward proportional to their practical value for community welfare. Historians still argue whether medieval communities intentionally structured the economic exploitation of essential but stigmatized services, or whether the undervaluation emerged naturally from market forces and social prejudices that created systematic disadvantages for workers in necessary but undesirable professions. The consistency of the pattern across different medieval communities suggests institutional rather than accidental creation of economic systems that benefited from essential services while minimizing compensation and social recognition for the workers who provided them. The moral implications of social systems that require essential services while stigmatizing service providers create ethical contradictions that medieval religious and philosophical frameworks struggled to address coherently. Christian theology emphasized both charity toward the unfortunate and divine ordination of social hierarchy, creating theological tensions when applied to people whose work served community needs, while marking them as social outcasts. Medieval moral philosophy couldn't easily reconcile the necessity of gong farming with social attitudes that treated the profession as evidence of divine disfavor. The political powerlessness of gong farmers reflects their social isolation and economic desperation while limiting their ability to advocate for improved working conditions, fair compensation, or basic recognition of their contributions to community welfare. Medieval political systems typically excluded people below certain social and economic thresholds from meaningful participation in governance, and gong farmers fell well below those thresholds despite providing services that affected everyone's daily life. The long-term sustainability of medieval waste management systems depended on maintaining adequate numbers of workers willing to accept permanent social exile in exchange for wages that barely covered survival, needs creating recruitment challenges that communities address through systematic creation of economic desperation rather than improved working conditions or social acceptance. The profession survived through a constant supply of people desperate enough to trade social status for immediate economic survival, but this recruitment model created inherent instability in essential service provision. The gradual destruction of your physical capabilities unfolds with the inexorable certainty of seasonal change, as years of lifting buckets loaded with substances that weigh more than stone systematically destroy joints, muscles, and bones that were never designed to handle such loads under toxic conditions that prevent proper healing and recovery. Your back develops a permanent curve from countless hours spent shoveling in cramped positions while breathing gases that reduce oxygen availability to muscles already strained beyond reasonable limits. Medieval understanding of anatomy was rudimentary, but even basic observation could document the distinctive physical deterioration that marked veteran gong farmers as clearly as their persistent odor, creating visible evidence of occupational damage that served as warnings about the long-term costs of essential but destructive work. The spinal compression that results from repeatedly lifting 40-pound buckets of waste while navigating unstable footing and toxic environments creates structural damage that medieval medicine couldn't treat effectively, and that modern medicine would classify as severe occupational injury, requiring immediate intervention and long-term rehabilitation. Your vertebrae designed for normal human activities, like farming and craftsmanship, must instead support loads that exceed their engineering specifications, while you work in positions that compound the stress through awkward angles and unstable surfaces that prevent proper lifting mechanics. The cumulative effect transforms your spine from a flexible support structure into a source of constant pain that limits every aspect of daily life. The joint deterioration affects not just your back, but your knees, hips, shoulders, and wrists, as the repetitive motions of gong farming create wear patterns that accelerate normal aging and create chronic pain conditions that medieval medicine attributed to bad humors, rather than understanding the mechanical damage caused by occupational stress. Your knees, subjected to constant climbing in and out of cesspits while carrying heavy loads, develop the kind of damage that would sideline modern athletes permanently. Medieval people accepted physical deterioration as natural consequences of aging, but gong farmers experienced accelerated breakdown that compressed decades of normal wear into a few years of intensive occupational abuse. The respiratory damage from years of breathing toxic gases compounds the physical problems by reducing your body's ability to deliver oxygen to muscles and organs that are already operating under stress from heavy labor and toxic exposure. Your lungs, scarred by chemical irritation and bacterial infections, struggle to provide adequate oxygenation for the physical demands of continued waste removal work, creating a cycle where reduced respiratory capacity makes physical labor more difficult, while the economic necessity of continued work prevents the rest and medical treatment that might slow further deterioration. The cardiovascular strain imposed by heavy labor in toxic environments accelerates heart disease and circulatory problems that medieval medicine couldn't diagnose specifically, but could observe through symptoms like shortness of breath, chest pain, and the distinctive blue-tinged complexion that indicated poor circulation among veteran gong farmers. Your heart, already working overtime to pump blood through a body poisoned by occupational toxins, must also support the increased demands of constant heavy lifting while operating on reduced oxygen supplies due to respiratory damage. The malnutrition caused by intestinal parasites and digestive system damage reduces your body's ability to repair the constant tissue damage caused by toxic exposure and physical strain, creating downward spirals where each health problem makes recovery from other problems increasingly unlikely. Medieval nutrition was marginal even for healthy people, but gong farmers faced additional challenges from organisms that competed for whatever nutrients they managed to consume, while toxic exposure increased their body's need for vitamins and minerals that their diets couldn't adequately provide. The immune system suppression that results from chronic toxic exposure leaves you vulnerable to infections and diseases that healthy people might fight off, successfully creating additional health complications that further reduce your ability to perform the physical labor that your economic survival depends on. Medieval understanding of immunity was theological rather than medical, but practical observation showed that gong farmers suffered from more frequent and severe illnesses than people in other occupations, reflecting the cumulative effects of occupational hazards that overwhelmed natural disease resistance. Historians still argue whether medieval communities understood the connection between gong farming and accelerated physical deterioration, or simply accepted the obvious correlation without investigating causation. But the pattern was clear enough that few people expected gong farmers to maintain normal working capacity beyond their 30s or early 40s. The visible evidence of occupational damage served as recruitment warnings that deterred all but the most desperate workers while creating labor shortages that communities addressed through systematic creation of economic desperation rather than improved working conditions. The pain management techniques available to medieval Gong farmers were limited to alcohol herbal remedies of questionable effectiveness and religious frameworks that emphasized accepting suffering as divine will rather than addressing its occupational causes through practical interventions. Medieval medicine couldn't provide effective treatment for the complex health problems caused by toxic exposure and repetitive stress injuries, leaving workers to manage chronic pain through crude methods that often created additional health problems while providing minimal relief. The psychological effects of watching your body systematically break down while knowing that continued work will accelerate the damage, create mental health challenges that medieval medicine couldn't address effectively. The knowledge that every day of work brings you closer to physical incapacity, while economic necessity prevents retirement or career change, creates despair that compounds the physical pain and social isolation already associated with the profession. The economic calculation of continuing to work despite obvious physical deterioration involves weighing immediate income needs against long-term health consequences that medieval workers understood intuitively, even without scientific explanation of the underlying biological processes. The choice between working while capable and facing immediate starvation created powerful incentives to continue despite clear evidence that each additional day of Gong farming brought you closer to complete physical breakdown and economic uselessness. The absence of any retirement plan in medieval society becomes particularly cruel when applied to a profession that systematically destroys workers' bodies and minds through occupational hazards that guarantee your inability to continue working long before normal aging would naturally end your career. Medieval economic systems assumed that workers would either die during their productive years or transition to lighter duties supported by family members who had achieved economic security through their own labor. But Gong farming creates circumstances where you age out of physical capability while remaining socially isolated from the family and community networks that provided medieval society's primary safety net for elderly and disabled workers. The mathematical reality of Gong farming economics reveals the impossibility of accumulating savings sufficient to support retirement when your wages barely cover immediate survival needs, while occupational health problems create additional expenses that consume whatever surplus income might theoretically allow for future planning. Medieval workers in other professions could reasonably expect their skills to remain valuable throughout their working lives, allowing experienced craftsmen to command higher wages that might support modest retirement savings. But Gong farming destroys rather than develops marketable capabilities while providing income that prioritizes immediate desperation over long-term financial planning. The physical timeline for career destruction in Gong farming typically spans 10 to 15 years from entry to complete incapacity, creating predictable trajectories where workers can observe their own future through examination of older colleagues whose deteriorated condition provides accurate previews of what awaits anyone foolish enough to imagine that their own experience might differ from the established pattern. Medieval people understood aging through observation of family and community members, But Gong farmers faced accelerated deterioration that compressed normal aging into abbreviated timelines that made retirement planning both necessary and impossible. The absence of guild protection or collective bargaining power leaves individual Gong farmers vulnerable to economic exploitation that continues even as their physical capabilities decline and their productivity decreases due to occupational health problems that are directly caused by the work they've been performing for community benefit. Medieval guild systems provided support for disabled and elderly craftsmen through collective funds and reduced duty positions that acknowledged veteran workers' contributions while managing their transition out of active labor. But Gong farmers operate outside these protective structures and must negotiate individual arrangements with employers who have no economic incentive to support workers whose productivity has declined. The knowledge transfer process that represents your primary value during the transition to incapacity involves teaching younger workers the techniques, safety procedures, and survival strategies that might help them last longer in the profession than you managed, while understanding that your accumulated expertise represents the only asset you possess that might provide modest income during the period between physical breakdown and death. Medieval apprenticeship systems recognized the value of experienced workers' knowledge while providing economic compensation for teaching services. But Gong farming knowledge transfer typically involves desperate older workers competing for the few available mentoring opportunities that might generate minimal income. The housing challenges faced by retired Gong farmers reflect both their limited financial resources and the persistent social stigma that makes finding appropriate shelter difficult, even when basic rent money might be available through charity or minimal pension arrangements. Medieval housing for elderly and disabled people typically depended on family support or religious institutions, but Gong farmers' social isolation limits access to both forms of assistance, while their occupational reputation makes them unwelcome in communities that might otherwise provide basic shelter for indigent elderly residents. The medical care available to elderly and disabled Gong farmers suffers from the same discrimination that affected their access to health care during their working years, compounded by additional complications created by limited income and the complex health problems caused by decades of toxic exposure that medieval medicine couldn't diagnose or treat effectively. Medieval medical charity focused primarily on acute conditions rather than chronic illnesses, and the distinctive health problems of veteran Gong farmers required ongoing care that charitable institutions couldn't provide sustainably. Historians still argue whether medieval communities developed systematic approaches to supporting elderly Gong farmers or simply accepted their premature death as inevitable consequences of occupational choices that workers made voluntarily. But the available evidence suggests that most communities preferred to ignore the problem rather than acknowledging collective responsibility for people whose essential work had provided community benefits while destroying their individual prospects for secure aging. The lack of retirement planning reflected broader medieval attitudes about individual responsibility and social obligation that prioritized immediate economic efficiency over long-term worker welfare. The family relationships that might provide support during retirement are often damaged or destroyed by the social stigma associated with gong farming, leaving workers without the kinship networks that provided medieval society's primary social safety net for elderly and disabled community members. Medieval families typically supported aging relatives through collective resources and shared housing arrangements, but Gong farmers' occupational reputation could extend to family members and create economic disadvantages that made supporting retired Gong farmers financially problematic for relatives who needed to maintain their own social standing. The existential questions raised by approaching incapacity without retirement resources create psychological challenges that medieval philosophy and religion couldn't address adequately, forcing workers to confront mortality and meaninglessness in ways that challenged available frameworks for understanding life purpose and divine justice. Medieval Christianity provided theological explanations for suffering that emphasized spiritual reward for earthly hardship, but Gong farmers faced circumstances that tested faith through practical demonstrations of social abandonment and economic futility. The competition for limited opportunities to remain economically productive despite physical decline creates tensions within Gong farming communities as older workers struggle to maintain income through mentoring consultation or reduced capacity work that younger workers might perform more efficiently. Medieval labor markets typically accommodated elderly workers through modified duties and reduced expectations, but Gong farming's physical demands leave little room for accommodation, while the limited economic opportunities create zero-sum competition among workers whose survival depends on continued employment despite obvious physical limitations. The moment arrives when your trembling hands can no longer grip the shovel handle with sufficient strength to lift even half-filled buckets, and your legs shake uncontrollably after climbing just halfway out of a cesspit, signaling that your career in humanity's most essential yet reviled profession has reached its inevitable conclusion. The transition from active worker to mentor represents the final phase of your Gong farming trajectory, where your accumulated knowledge about survival in toxic environments becomes your only remaining economic asset in a profession that has systematically destroyed every other aspect of your marketable capabilities. Medieval craftsmanship traditions recognize the value of master knowledge passed to apprentices, but Gong farming mentorship involves teaching survival techniques for work that nobody should have to perform to people who have no other choice but to learn from your hard-won expertise. The recruitment of your replacement typically involves identifying someone whose desperation matches or exceeds what drove you into the profession, originally creating cyclical patterns where economic catastrophe generates the human resources necessary to maintain essential waste management services that communities require but prefer not to acknowledge. Your role shifts from primary worker to guide and advisor for someone who represents your younger self, hungry, desperate, and willing to trade social status for survival wages while believing that their experience might somehow differ from the predictable trajectory of occupational destruction that you've just completed. The knowledge transfer process involves teaching practical skills that can't be learned from books or formal instruction because medieval waste management expertise exists only in the accumulated experience of people who have survived long enough to develop techniques for staying alive while working in environments designed to kill anyone foolish enough to enter them voluntarily. You demonstrate proper shovel technique, safety protocols for gas exposure, team coordination strategies, and dozens of minor survival tricks that represent the difference between lasting a few months versus lasting several years in a profession that measures career success through duration rather than advancement. The emotional complexity of training your replacement involves conflicting feelings about perpetuating a system that you know will destroy another human being, while understanding that essential services must continue regardless of their human cost, and someone will perform this work whether or not you participate in the training process. Medieval apprenticeship traditions emphasized the moral obligation of master craftsmen to share their knowledge with younger workers, but Gong farming mentorship carries additional weight because your expertise might literally save your successor's life during the countless emergencies that characterize waste management work. The safety instruction that forms the core of your teaching responsibilities focuses on recognizing the warning signs of toxic gas exposure, understanding the structural limitations of cesspit construction, and developing the teamwork skills that represent the primary survival mechanism available to workers in an inherently dangerous profession. Medieval occupational safety knowledge existed primarily as oral tradition passed between workers who had learned survival techniques through direct experience with hazards that killed less observant or less fortunate colleagues. The psychological preparation for your replacement involves explaining the social consequences of gong farming that extend far beyond work hours to affect every aspect of personal and family life through persistent stigma that marks workers permanently, regardless of their individual character or accomplishments outside the profession. You share strategies for managing social isolation, maintaining personal dignity despite community rejection, and developing the mental resilience necessary to continue working while being treated as less than fully human by the people whose waste you remove. The equipment maintenance instruction covers both practical techniques for prolonging the life of expensive tools and theoretical understanding of how waste management equipment functions under conditions that exceed normal engineering specifications. Medieval craftsmanship couldn't produce equipment specifically designed for gong farming applications, so workers developed modification and maintenance techniques that adapted available tools for specialized uses while maximizing durability under toxic and corrosive working conditions. Historians still argue whether the knowledge preservation function of gong farming mentorship represented genuine professional development or simply practical necessity for maintaining essential services, regardless of their human cost. But the detailed nature of the expertise suggests that medieval waste management had evolved into a specialized craft with genuine technical requirements that exceeded simple manual labor. The survival techniques, safety protocols, and efficiency methods that you pass along represent innovations developed through generations of workers who discovered what worked through direct experimentation with potentially fatal mistakes. The economic negotiation involved in mentorship compensation reflects your transitional status between active worker and complete economic uselessness, creating opportunities for modest income while acknowledging that your teaching services have limited duration before your replacement acquires sufficient independence to continue without guidance. Medieval apprenticeship systems provided ongoing economic relationships between masters and former students, but Gong farming mentorship typically involves brief, intensive training periods followed by complete severance of economic ties. The succession planning aspect of training your replacement includes introducing them to the informal networks of Gong farming crews, waste disposal contacts, and municipal authorities who coordinate the essential services that keep medieval communities from drowning in their own waste. This social capital represents perhaps your most valuable contribution to your successor's survival prospects, as the personal relationships and professional reputation you've developed provide access to better job opportunities and emergency support that individual workers couldn't develop independently. The final lessons you impart cover philosophical frameworks for maintaining hope and dignity while performing work that society considers degrading, drawing on whatever wisdom you've accumulated about finding meaning in essential labor that serves community needs despite being systematically undervalued and stigmatized. Medieval religious and philosophical traditions provided limited guidance for people whose occupational circumstances challenged standard assumptions about divine justice and social order. So Gong farmers developed their own frameworks for understanding their place in the cosmic hierarchy. The cruel irony of your situation becomes crystalline as you watch the community continue its daily routines while systematically erasing any acknowledgement of the essential services you provided that made their comfortable existence possible. Medieval society possessed remarkable capacity for collective amnesia when it came to acknowledging dependence on stigmatized workers, creating social dynamics where communities could benefit from essential services while maintaining plausible deniability about the human costs required to provide them. Your years of voluntary descent into toxic environments that prevented disease outbreaks and maintained basic sanitation standards vanish from community memory like morning mist, leaving no trace of recognition for work that literally kept everyone else alive and healthy. The people who once crossed streets to avoid your presence now walk those same streets without any conscious awareness that their pleasant morning strolls are possible only because someone spent years removing the accumulating waste that would otherwise transform their neighborhood into a disease-ridden wasteland, uninhabitable by civilized human beings. Medieval urban planning took waste management for granted in ways that modern city planners would recognize as systematic infrastructure, neglect disguised as social convenience. The invisible nature of successful waste management means that communities notice Gong farming services only when they fail, creating appreciation patterns that acknowledge problems while ignoring solutions. The children who once fled when they saw you approaching now play freely in areas that remain habitable only because of services you provided, while accepting social exile as payment for community health benefits that no one wanted to calculate or acknowledge directly. Medieval childhood education included practical lessons about avoiding various social hazards, but it didn't include instruction about recognizing or appreciating the essential work performed by people that polite society preferred to pretend didn't exist. These children grow up in environments that benefit from waste management services while learning social attitudes that stigmatize the workers who provide them. The merchants who once reluctantly accepted your contaminated coins now conduct business in commercial districts that remain economically viable only because adequate waste management prevented the disease outbreaks and sanitation disasters that would have collapsed medieval urban economies faster than warfare or famine. Medieval commerce depended on maintaining public spaces where buyers and sellers could interact safely, but the infrastructure requirements for such spaces included waste management services that operated outside normal commercial recognition or appreciation. The economic benefits of your work exceeded your lifetime earnings by orders of magnitude that no medieval accounting system bothered to calculate. The religious institutions that questioned your spiritual condition while you were working now benefit from congregational health and community stability that reflects successful waste management rather than divine intervention. Though medieval theology preferred explanations that emphasized spiritual rather than practical causes for community welfare, churches that might have provided charity for your current destitution operated in neighborhoods that remained habitable partly because of services you provided while being excluded from full participation in religious community life due to occupational stigma. The municipal authorities who coordinated your services now manage waste systems that continue to function through the work of your replacement and other desperate workers who accepted the same social exile and health risks that defined your career, maintaining institutional amnesia about individual workers while acknowledging abstract needs for continued services. Medieval urban administration recognized waste management as necessary infrastructure while avoiding personal acknowledgement of the workers who provided it, creating bureaucratic systems that functioned through deliberate ignorance of human costs. The public health benefits of your career become most visible through the absence of problems that your work prevented disease outbreaks that didn't occur, water contamination, events that were avoided, and sanitation disasters that never developed because someone accepted permanent social stigma in exchange for maintaining essential services. Medieval medical understanding couldn't explain disease transmission scientifically, but practical observation demonstrated clear correlations between waste management quality and community health outcomes that made Gong farming services essential regardless of their social acceptability. Historians still argue whether medieval communities developed deliberate strategies for maintaining essential but stigmatized services through systematic social amnesia, or whether the collective forgetting emerged naturally from psychological discomfort with acknowledging dependence on work that challenged comfortable assumptions about social hierarchy and divine justice. The consistency of the forgetting pattern across different communities suggests institutional rather than accidental development of social systems that benefited from essential services while avoiding acknowledgement of their human costs. The economic legacy of your work continues to benefit community members who participate in markets' own property and conduct business in areas that remain viable, partly because adequate waste management prevented the kind of sanitation disasters that destroyed medieval communities whose waste systems failed catastrophically. Medieval property values, commercial activity, and residential desirability all reflected successful infrastructure management that included waste services. But the economic benefits were distributed throughout the community, while the costs were concentrated on individual workers who provided the services. The social invisibility that defined your working life continues into retirement as community members who benefited from your services maintain the comfortable fiction that essential infrastructure functions through divine providence or natural processes rather than human labor performed under conditions that challenge basic assumptions about civilized society. Medieval social hierarchies required systematic denial of dependence on stigmatized workers to maintain comfortable distinctions between respectable and degraded forms of labor. The existential questions raised by your forgotten contribution to community welfare challenge medieval frameworks for understanding individual worth social justice and divine order in ways that religious and philosophical authorities preferred not to examine directly. Your life's work provided genuine community benefits while destroying your individual prospects for security recognition or social integration, creating contradictions that medieval moral philosophy couldn't resolve satisfactorily without acknowledging uncomfortable truths about the human costs of essential services that civilized society required but refused to value appropriately. The tools that once defined your daily existence now rest against the wall of a storage shed, their wooden handles worn smooth by your grip, and their metal surfaces bearing the patina of substances that no respectable implement should ever encounter. Yet these crude instruments represent the accumulated wisdom of generations who discovered what works when civilization requires someone to descend voluntarily into humanity's collective waste stream. Your shovel rope and buckets embody practical knowledge about survival in toxic environments that medieval universities never documented, but that represents a genuine expertise developed through direct confrontation with challenges that killed less observant or less fortunate workers who attempted the same essential tasks without benefit of hard-won experience. The continuity of waste management services depends on this transfer of specialized knowledge from one generation of desperate workers to the next, creating intellectual traditions that exist outside formal educational systems while addressing practical problems that threaten community survival if left unresolved by people willing to accept social exile as payment for essential work. Medieval craftsmanship traditions recognize the value of accumulated expertise, but Gong farming knowledge exists in a social limbo where communities benefit from the results while refusing to acknowledge the human intelligence required to develop effective techniques for staying alive while performing work that challenges basic assumptions about human dignity and social value. The young man who now carries your tools represents the latest iteration of a cyclical process where economic desperation generates the human resources necessary to maintain services that keep medieval communities from drowning in their own waste, perpetuating systems that function through systematic creation of social outcasts who accept health risks and occupational hazards that would be distributed differently in societies that valued human welfare over social comfort. His trembling hands grip the shovel handle with the same desperate determination that once marked your own entry into a profession that offers survival wages in exchange for physical destruction and permanent social stigma. The institutional memory preserved through this succession of workers encompasses not just practical techniques for waste removal, but broader understanding of how essential services function in societies that require systematic denial of their human costs to maintain comfortable illusions about social hierarchy and divine justice. Medieval communities developed sophisticated mechanisms for ensuring continuity of necessary but stigmatized work while avoiding direct acknowledgement of the individual workers whose lives were consumed in providing services that made civilized existence possible for everyone else. The social engineering required to maintain adequate gong farming capacity reveals deliberate construction of economic desperation that guarantees someone will always be desperate enough to accept work that offers immediate survival at the cost of long-term health, social integration, and personal dignity, creating renewable supplies of workers for essential services that communities require but prefer not to acknowledge directly. Medieval economic systems achieved remarkable efficiency in concentrating occupational hazards among people who lacked alternatives while distributing benefits throughout communities that could maintain plausible ignorance about the human costs of their comfort and safety. The philosophical implications of work that serves essential community functions while destroying individual workers challenge medieval frameworks for understanding divine justice, social order, and individual worth in ways that religious and secular authorities avoided examining directly because the conclusions might undermine comfortable assumptions about the moral basis of existing social hierarchies. Your career represents a practical demonstration of contradictions between stated values about human dignity and actual practices that require systematic sacrifice of individual welfare for collective benefit. The environmental impact of medieval waste management continues long after individual workers have been consumed by the systems they served, creating landscape modifications, soil composition changes, and ecological adaptations that represent permanent monuments to essential work performed by people whose individual contributions were systematically forgotten while their collective impact shaped the physical environment in ways that influenced community development for generations beyond their own brief careers, involuntary exile from social acceptability. Historians still argue whether medieval waste management systems represented rational responses to practical challenges or reflected deeper cultural patterns that required systematic creation of social outcasts to maintain psychological boundaries between respectable and degraded forms of human activity. But the consistency of these patterns across different communities suggests institutional development rather than accidental evolution of social systems that functioned through deliberate denial of their human costs. The legacy embedded in those silent tools encompasses all the accumulated wisdom about survival dignity and meaning that Gong farmers developed while performing work that challenged every assumption about human value and social justice, creating knowledge traditions that exist outside formal recognition while addressing fundamental questions about how civilized societies manage essential functions that no one wants to acknowledge, requiring human sacrifice disguised as economic opportunity. The next generation of workers will learn these lessons again through direct experience with challenges that remain unchanged despite centuries of technological and social development, perpetuating cycles where individual workers discover through personal suffering what previous generations learned about staying alive while performing essential work that serves community needs while systematically destroying the people who provide it. The tools wait patiently for hands that will grip them with the same desperate hope that once motivated your own entry into humanity's most necessary yet reviled profession. Your shovel leans against the wall like a monument to choices made under circumstances that offered no real alternatives, bearing witness to human resilience and community necessity, while serving as silent testimony to the contradictions inherent in social systems that require essential services while refusing to acknowledge their true costs. The metal has been shaped by substances that shouldn't exist and forces that exceed normal engineering specifications, yet it endures as evidence that someone cared enough about community welfare to accept personal destruction as payment for services that kept civilization functioning despite its own moral blindness about the human price of comfort and safety. The darkness of your career may be ending, but your story joins countless others in the quiet corners of history where essential work was done by forgotten hands. As you drift toward sleep tonight, remember that every society depends on people willing to do what others won't, often without recognition, rarely with thanks, but always with the knowledge that their sacrifice matters. The tools may rest now, but the work continues carried forward by others who understand that dignity isn't always found in the task itself, but in the courage to accept what life demands when survival hangs in the balance. Some stories end not with triumph, but with the quiet satisfaction of duty fulfilled even when that duty came at great personal cost. In the gentle hum of your fan and the softness of your pillow, you can rest knowing that while your imaginary medieval life was harsh, your real life holds far gentler possibilities. The night is yours now, free from cesspits and social exile, filled instead with the simple comfort of clean sheets and tomorrow's open potential. Sleep well and dream of easier times ahead.